Okay, so here we are. This is the last key issue in Unit 4, Political Geography Unit. So this is our last key issue, Chapter 8, Key Issue 2, Why do boundaries between states, remember states is another word for countries in this class, why do the boundaries between these countries cause problems? So let's take a look here, what we're starting with here. I don't know why this isn't going. There we go. What we're starting here is with colonialism. So to really understand a country and the boundaries, we need to understand some things about colonialism. These are the colonial possessions you see in 1914 throughout the world. By the outbreak of World War I, European states held colonies throughout the world, especially throughout Africa and in much of Asia. So you can see that by 1914, all of these countries, they were no longer under Spanish influence. But at some point, all these, pretty much most of these countries in Latin America had been under Spanish influence, with the exception of Brazil here had been under Portuguese rule. The U.S. Was independent at the time. So as we look at Africa, you can see that in 1914 and then at the end of World War II, most of these countries gained their independence. But these countries, vast majority of them were still under colonial rule, and you saw a lot in France. So much of northern France, so much of northern Africa was under French control. That's why that colonial legacy, so much of them, the people who are migrating out of these North African countries are going to France because they speak French and they have that familiarity with the French culture. You see that the British had quite a few colonies here, especially in southern Africa and East Africa. And then the British had most of South Asia. At the time, they were also heavily influential into Southwest Asia. And then you saw a lot of British influence into Southeast Asia, too. This colonialism shaped so much of the current political environment. So a colony is a territory that is legally tied to a separate sovereign state rather than being completely independent. So again, a colony, when the United States was a colony of Britain, the United States wasn't free. The United States was instead a colony, a separate territory that it was legally tied to Britain. The UK had the largest colonial empire. They had colonies on every continent. France had the second largest. They had the most in West Africa and Southeast Asia. Portugal, Spain, Germany, Italy, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Belgium all established colonies outside of Europe. You saw a lot of Belgium in parts of Africa. Some Germany was in Africa as well. Germany tried to compete with Britain and France by obtaining African colonies. Next, let's talk about the motives for colonization. For the European countries, mainly, it was to promote Christianity, provide resources to help their economy of those European countries, and just build number of colonies so that equaled their level of power, or what we call God, gold, and glory. So again, they wanted to spread Christianity. They wanted to get the riches, the resources from these colonies in order to continue to drive their economic development within the European states. And just because the number of colonies they had meant that they had glory, the more power that they had. So a lot of colonial practices, most African and Asian colonies, they did become independent after World War II. We will see, especially in the urbanization unit, so many of these European countries, like when you go to countries in Latin America, you will notice that many of the cities in Latin America are designed very similarly to cities in Spain and in Portugal. Same thing, like a lot of the British cities, a lot of the cities in Africa, even in places like Singapore, the cities in Hong Kong even, you notice that their governments, the cities, their areas are designed very much like a lot of the cities in Britain are. So that's also part of the colonial legacy. They set up a lot of the cities, the colonial powers they felt like their countries were so superior that when they went to the colonies should be exactly like where they had left behind. So they tried to recreate that in the new places. Colonies today, most colonies of today are islands in the Pacific Ocean or the Caribbean Sea. The most populous colony in the world is Puerto Rico, and that is controlled by the United States. So the most populous colony in the world is Puerto Rico, controlled by the United States. So here we see our colonial possessions in 2003, and like I said, you'll notice that most of them are in just islands in the oceans. So most of them you see are just different islands in the Pacific Ocean or the Caribbean. Next, let's talk about the state shapes. So let's find that section on the guided notes. So again, you should be completing this on the guided notes. So let's find the part about state shapes. First state shape is compact state. This benefit of this is efficiency. And you can see here, this is a compact state. You notice that it's pretty small, pretty much the same distance from the center to any other parts. So the distance from the center to any boundary does not vary significantly. It's shaped like a circle with a capital at the center. You see here San Jose at the center. This is beneficial for most smaller states as they provide good communication that can be more easily established to all regions. Also, transportation is so easy from all regions as well, from the capital, which should be the center of their country, to basically the communication and transportation out. Examples of this would be Burundi, Kenya, Rwanda, Uganda. These are all examples of compact states. Austria is a compact state as well in Europe. So this is about efficiency. Next, let's talk about prorupted states. This is about access or disruption. So basically, a prorupted state is you have a compact state with a finger sticking out. So it's basically a compact state with a finger that sticks out. And that finger is really the proruption. Namibia is an example of a prorupted state. It's a former colony of Germany's, and the proruption is in the east along what they call the Caprivi Strip. And this gave them access to the Zambezi River, but it also disrupted communication of the British colonies. And so this colony of Namibia was German, and they didn't want the British colonies to be touching, so they claimed this strip called the Caprivi Strip, that would keep them from having touching boundaries. This also gave them access to resources in Central Africa. So a lot of benefits here. This is very, very typical of a prorupted state. It's typically to gain access to some sort of water resource or to provide a buffer zone between two warring states. So again, can provide a state with access to a resource such as water, or separate two states that otherwise would share a boundary, what's called a buffer zone between the two. So you can see here's an example. This is Namibia, and this is the Caprivi Strip, and this was to gain them access to the Zambezi River and some access the resources in Central Africa, but also to keep these two British colonies from having boundaries between them as a way to kind of disrupt their control. Also, Afghanistan is a prorupted state. You see it's otherwise compact, and then it has this finger sticking out. And this proruption for Afghanistan, this was to keep Russia from having a direct boundary with Pakistan. So this was to keep Russia from having a direct border with Pakistan. Next are elongated states. This is an issue can be for them is this potential isolation. You can see it's very clear. Argentina is elongated. Chile is elongated. Italy is elongated. These are states with a long and narrow shape. This would also be like Thailand is elongated. The best example is Chile, and less extreme examples are Italy, Gambia, and Malawi, which is in Africa. Elongated states may suffer from poor internal communication because there's so much extremeness in where they are from north to south. You can see that, especially in Italy. Northern Italy is very different from central Italy and extremely different from southern Italy. So this can kind of lead to isolation and poor communication. Next are fragmented states. These can be problematic. There are different types of fragmented states. One would be areas that are separated by water, be like into different islands, like fragmented, like down here Indonesia, you can see is so heavily fragmented. Also can be fragmented like the United States is. The United States is fragmented because we are separated By ocean, so by island would be Hawaii, but from Alaska, divided by a separate country. So Alaska is separated from the U.S. by Canada, and we are lucky that we have a good relationship with Canada. Otherwise, it could be problematic if this was a hostile relationship, then Alaska would be pretty isolated. So Indonesia, an example, Russia, Panama, India, these are all examples of fragmented states. Again, this can be really difficult because it can lead to a lot of isolation. And then you have a lot more centrifugal devolutionary forces. You tend to have a lot more devolutionary forces in elongated and in fragmented states. Next are perforated states. South Africa is an example of a perforated state. So is Italy, is also perforated. And a perforated state is a country that completely surrounds another country. So you can see here is South Africa. Here is Lesotho. Lesotho is a separate country. It had a history of self-rule. It was a kingdom. So when South Africa gained its independence, it also gave this independence to Lesotho. And so South Africa completely surrounds Lesotho. And this can be really, Lesotho is called the enclave. South Africa is the perforated state, the one that completely surrounds. So again, the one that completely surrounds is the perforated state. Italy completely surrounds San Marino, which also makes it a perforated state. So here we have some African states. Again, you see a lot of the compact states. Here's Rwanda, Burundi. These are compact. You see some elongated. Here's Malawi is elongated. Mozambique is elongated. You will see the prorupted, which is Namibia. You will see the perforated, which is South Africa surrounding Lesotho. Fragmented. Some of these countries are, you see that they have some islands off of the coast, which cause them to be fragmented. Next, let's talk about this landlocked states. Please find this on your handout. Being landlocked is perhaps one of the worst case scenarios for a country. There are a lot of landlocked countries in Africa. This is a carryover, a leftover from the colonial rule, the superimposed boundaries on the colonial Africa, where the Europeans, instead of fighting over Africa, they got together at the Berlin Conference and they laid out a map of Africa and they just carved it up. And as a result of that, you see a lot of those straight line boundaries, the geometric boundaries, but you also see a lot of landlocked states. And so example would be like a Lesotho is completely surrounded by South Africa. And in Southern Africa, you see a lot of landlocked states. The prevalence is in Africa because it's a remnant of the colonial era when Britain and France controlled extensive regions. This means that you do not have any direct access to an ocean, and this direct access to an ocean is critical to states for international trade. This allows them to send and receive goods by sea. The landlocked state must arrange to use another country's seaport, which they have to pay for. And so to exist in a global marketplace today, which is what we have as a global marketplace, like Botswana or Zambia, they may have mineral resources or oil resources that they want to ship out and sell to the rest of the world, but they don't have access to a seaport at all. So they would have to make an arrangement with one of these surrounding countries that are on the seaport to use their seaport. And this becomes very challenging because the challenges are they don't have any access to the sea, which increases their cost of imports. So those goods that they have to import into their country, let's say they want to buy Nike tennis shoes, well, they have to import those. First, they have to pay that country on the seaport to allow them to import that country, or excuse me, those goods into their seaport. Then they have to pay to transport them all the way through that country into their own country, whether that be by rail, typically rail because rail over land is the least expensive. So it's the cheapest form of transportation is rail over land, or by river. It's the increased cost to export goods. Again, same cost to get those goods out of their country to sell on the global marketplace. They have to transport them through their country, through the other country, to that country's seaport, and then pay that country to use that seaport. They have limited road or rail transportation for imported goods in bulk. They need economic cooperation with their countries surrounding them. It places them in a very vulnerable, hostile position.